I'm Fiona Keller, 28 years old, and I've spent years living under the weight of mockery from my own family. That dinner, which seemed just like any other, turned out to be the turning point of my life. My parents leaned across the table, smirking as they said, "Fiona, you'll never own a house like Bryce." My brother Bryce, always their pride, grinned and added, "She'll be broke forever." Their laughter echoed in my head, each word cutting deep into my dream of building a life as a freelance coder. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting their voices fade into static, silently promising myself that one day I would prove them wrong. 1 week later, they were standing at my doorstep, pressing the doorbell again and again, unable to believe I actually owned the Tudor house in Maple Grove, Pittsburgh. I opened the door, stared them down, and said, "Get off my property." The door slammed shut, and in that moment I felt free, as if I had finally broken the invisible chains that had bound me for years. That was the beginning of the story I'm about to tell, how I went from being dismissed and ridiculed to standing tall, turning their laughter into silence. A story of grit, fairness, and building a life they could never take away from me. Before we dive into my story, tell me, what time is it where you're watching, and which city are you in? I want to know how far this story has traveled. Let me take you back to where it all started. Growing up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, I lived in a modest split-level house with my mother, Laura Keller, my father, Dennis Keller, and my brother, Bryce. Our neighborhood was all cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns, the kind of place where everyone knew your business. Bryce, a few years older than me, was the family's shining star. He landed a finance job right out of college, the kind that came with a corner office and a fat bonus. By his mid-20s, he'd bought a sleek condo in the city, and my parents never let me forget it. "Bryce has his life together," Mom would say, her voice sharp as she stirred her coffee. "He's not wasting his potential." Dad, sitting at the kitchen table, would nod, his silence louder than her words. I was in my late 20s, still figuring things out, and their comparisons stung like salt in a cut. I'd always loved coding, building apps, solving problems with lines of code. But when I chose freelance programming over a stable 9 to 5, Mom called it foolish. Dad didn't disagree. They'd point to Bryce's paycheck, his car, his condo, and ask why I couldn't be more like him. I remember one Christmas, Bryce showed up with a new watch gleaming under the dining room light. "Investment banking pays for the good stuff," he bragged, flashing it at me. Mom beamed. Dad clapped his shoulder. I'd just landed my first big coding contract, but when I mentioned it, Mom cut me off. "That's nice, Fiona, but Bryce just closed $1 million deal." I forced a smile, my chest tight. It wasn't just that they favored Bryce, it was how they made me feel invisible. School was no different. Bryce was the debate team captain, always in the spotlight. I spent hours in the computer lab teaching myself Python, but no one noticed. Once I won a regional coding competition, and I rushed home to tell them. Dad glanced up from his newspaper. "That's great, honey. Did you hear Bryce got promoted?" My trophy sat on my desk, gathering dust. Their words built a wall between us, brick by brick. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was subtle, a glance, a sigh, a question about when I'd get serious. Mom would lecture me about financial security, holding up Bryce as the example. "He's set for life," she'd say, as if my path was a dead end. Dad rarely spoke up, but his silence felt like agreement. I'd lie awake at night replaying their words, wondering if I'd ever measure up. I tried to connect with them. I'd invite them to dinner, hoping to share my world. But every conversation circled back to Bryce, his deals, his plans, his success. Once I showed Mom a website I'd built for a startup. She scrolled for 10 seconds, then said, "Bryce's firm just went public." Isn't that amazing? I stopped trying after that. Living in their shadow wasn't just about comparison, it was about erasure. My dreams, my work, my choices didn't matter. I'd sit in my tiny rented apartment in downtown Pittsburgh, staring at my laptop, coding late into the night. Each project was a step toward something bigger, but my parents couldn't see it. To them, I was chasing a fantasy while Bryce lived the American dream. The worst part, I still wanted their approval. I'd imagine the day they'd look at me and say, "We're proud of you, Fiona." But every family gathering, every phone call reminded me that day wasn't coming. Bryce's success was their yardstick, and I'd never measure up. I didn't know it then, but those years of being sidelined were planting a seed, one that would grow into something they'd never expect. Everything came to a head at a family dinner last summer. I drove out to my parents' house in the Pittsburgh suburbs, bracing myself for the usual routine. The table was set with Mom's usual spread: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and tension thick enough to cut. My mother was fussing over the plates while my father scrolled on his phone, barely looking up. Bryce strutted in late, his tailored suit screaming money. He'd just bought a new house in a ritzy suburb, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. "Check this out," Bryce said, sliding his phone across the table. A photo of his modern glass-walled house flashed on the screen. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, and a view that kills. Mom's eyes lit up. "That's incredible, Bryce," she said, her voice dripping with pride. Dad nodded, setting his phone down for the first time. "You've really outdone yourself, son." I sat there poking at my food, waiting for the inevitable. It didn't take long. Mom turned to me, her smile fading. "Fiona, you're still renting that little apartment downtown, aren't you?" Her tone was sharp, like she was scolding a child. Before I could answer, Bryce leaned back, smirking. "Yeah, Fee, how's that freelance coding gig going? Still scraping by?" I clenched my fork, my face burning. I'd just landed a contract with a tech startup, but I didn't bother mentioning it. They wouldn't care. "It's fine," I said, keeping my voice steady. Mom shook her head. "You should have gone into something stable like Bryce. He's got a real career." Dad chimed in, his voice low. "Freelancing's risky, Fiona. You need a plan." I stared at my plate, their words piling on like bricks. "Bryce wasn't done. She'll be broke forever," he said, laughing, his eyes glinting with amusement. Mom and Dad chuckled along as if my life was a punchline. I wanted to scream, to tell them about the late nights coding the clients I'd won, the money I was saving. But I'd tried that before, and it never mattered. Instead, I took a slow breath, forcing a smile. Maybe I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Inside, though, something snapped. Their laughter wasn't just cruel, it was a line in the sand. I wasn't going to keep begging for their respect. The rest of the dinner dragged on. Bryce kept bragging: his new car, his promotion, his perfect life. Mom hung on every word, asking about his house's granite countertops and smart home system. Dad threw in questions about property taxes, nodding like Bryce was some financial genius. I stayed quiet, my mind racing. I'd spent years chasing their approval, but what was the point? They'd never see me the way they saw Bryce. As I cleared my plate, Mom tried to soften the blow. "Fiona, we just want you to be secure," she said, her voice patronizing. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Bryce caught my eye, his smirk still there. "Don't worry, Fee. You'll figure it out someday," he said, like he was tossing me a bone. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Driving back to my apartment that night, the city lights blurring past, I made a decision. I was done with their comparisons, their jabs, their dismissal of everything I'd worked for. I wouldn't call, wouldn't visit, wouldn't waste another second trying to prove myself to them. My coding was my future, not their opinions. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and felt a spark of clarity. This wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing myself. I didn't know it then, but that dinner was the last time I'd sit at their table. Their words had lit a fire, not of anger, but of resolve. I'd build something they couldn't ignore, something they couldn't touch. And I'd do it on my terms. That night, I made a choice. I'd pour everything into my work, my coding, my passion, my future. Back in my small downtown Pittsburgh apartment, I opened my laptop and got to work. I'd been freelancing as a coder for years, taking small gigs to pay the rent. But after that dinner, I went all in. I built a website for my services, branding myself as a software developer specializing in mobile apps. I reached out to every tech startup I could find in Pittsburgh's growing tech scene. My inbox filled with rejections at first, but I kept pitching. Then, one morning, I got a response from a startup building a fitness app. They wanted me to develop their back-end system. It was a 6-month contract, and the pay was more than I'd made in a year. I didn't stop there. I registered a small business calling it CodePath Solutions. It wasn't much, just a name and a tax ID, but it felt like a declaration. I was building something real, something mine. I worked 16-hour days debugging code, meeting deadlines, and learning to negotiate contracts. By month 3, I'd signed 2 more clients, a food delivery app and an e-commerce platform. My bank account, once barely covering rent, started to grow. One evening, I met my friend Irene Shaw for coffee. I was exhausted, doubting if I could keep up the pace. Irene, who ran her own graphic design business, listened as I poured out my fears. "Fiona," she said, her voice firm, "you're good at this. Better than good. You're building something real. Don't let anyone, especially your family, make you think otherwise." Her words hit me hard. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I went home that night and stared at my laptop, her encouragement fueling me. I didn't need my family's approval. I needed to believe in myself. Money started coming in faster than I expected. The fitness app contract led to a referral for another project, this time a travel booking system. I hired a part-time assistant to handle emails so I could focus on coding. By month 6, I was earning more than I'd ever thought possible. I opened a savings account and watched the balance climb. For the first time, I let myself dream bigger. I'd always wanted a house, not just any house, but one that felt like a home, a place where I could build my life on my terms. I kept my family at a distance. Mom sent a few texts asking why I hadn't called. I replied with short, vague messages, busy with work. Dad left a voicemail once asking if I was coming to their anniversary party. I didn't respond. Bryce, true to form, didn't reach out at all. I didn't care. Their voices, those jabs about my risky career, my little apartment, faded as I focused on my goals. I wasn't hiding my success. I just didn't see the point in sharing it with people who'd never cared. One night, while scrolling real estate listings, I stumbled across a Tudor-style house in Maple Grove, Pittsburgh. The photos showed arched doorways, stained glass windows, and a backyard big enough for a garden. My heart raced. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. I could see myself there, working from a home office, living a life I'd built from scratch. I wasn't ready to buy yet, but the idea took root. I called my bank the next day asking about mortgage pre-approval. The numbers they quoted made my head spin, but they also made it real. I could do this. By month 8, I was juggling 4 clients and turning down offers because I couldn't keep up. CodePath Solutions wasn't just a side hustle anymore, it was a business. I upgraded my laptop, rented a co-working space for client meetings, and even started thinking about hiring another developer. The girl who'd been laughed at over roast chicken was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, someone who wasn't afraid to bet on herself. I didn't know it then, but I was laying the foundation for something bigger than I'd ever imagined. The house in Maple Grove wasn't just a dream, it was a goal, and I was closer to it than anyone, especially my family, could have guessed. 8 months later, I got a call from Daniel Porter. My financial advisor. Daniel had been tracking my savings since I started CodePath Solutions. "Fiona," he said, his voice calm but excited, "you're in a strong position. Have you thought about real estate?" I hadn't, not seriously. I'd been so focused on work that buying a house felt like a distant fantasy. But Daniel laid out the numbers, my income, my savings, the market in Pittsburgh. "A house in a good neighborhood could be an investment in your future," he said. I hung up my mind, buzzing. Maybe it was time. I spent weeks scrolling listings online, each house a possibility I hadn't dared imagine before. One stood out, a Tudor-style home in Maple Grove, Pittsburgh, a neighborhood known for its historic charm and tree-lined streets. The listing showed a brick facade, arched doorways, and a garden that screamed potential. I booked a viewing the next day, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. At the open house, I met Mrs. Rose Turner, the owner. Rose, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 80s, walked me through the house herself. "This place has soul," she said, pointing to the oak floors and stained glass windows. "I won't sell to just anyone." I nodded, instantly smitten. The living room had a stone fireplace perfect for quiet nights. The upstairs study overlooked a garden ideal for a home office. Every detail felt right, like the house was waiting for me. Rose asked about my work. I told her about my coding business, how I'd built it from scratch. Her eyes softened. "You've got grit," she said. "This house needs someone who'll love it like I have." We talked for an hour, sharing stories about Pittsburgh's quirks and her memories of the house. By the end, she squeezed my hand. "I think you're the one," she said. I left with her blessing and a determination to make it happen. Daniel helped me crunch the numbers. My savings covered the down payment, and my contracts ensured I could handle the mortgage. I put in an offer that week, barely sleeping as I waited for a response. When Daniel called to say it was accepted, I sat on my apartment floor, stunned. This wasn't just a house, it was proof I'd made it, proof I didn't need anyone's approval. The closing process was a blur of paperwork and signatures. By summer's end, I held the keys to my new home. I walked through the front door alone, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was mine. No one could take it away. Not my mother, not my father, not Bryce. I spent that first night on a sleeping bag in the living room, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd finally found my place. Then came the renovations. I wanted to honor the house's Tudor charm while making it my own. I hired a contractor to refinish the oak floors, keeping their rich grain intact. The stained glass windows, cloudy with age, were restored to their original glow. I turned the upstairs study into a home office with a desk facing the garden for late-night coding sessions. I added built-in bookshelves for my tech manuals and a cozy reading nook by the fireplace. Every choice was deliberate, every detail a reflection of me. Moving in was surreal. I packed up my tiny apartment, leaving behind the cramped space where I'd rebuilt my life. The first morning in Maple Grove, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the stained glass, casting colors across the floor. I set up my laptop in the office, my monitors humming as I worked on a new client project. This wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a space where I could be myself without judgment. I didn't tell my family. They didn't deserve to know. Mom had sent a text a few weeks earlier asking if I was still doing that computer thing. I didn't reply. Dad's calls had stopped months ago. Bryce has always stayed silent. I didn't care. This house, this life was mine, built from my own sweat and determination. I'd turned a dream into reality, and that was enough. 2 weeks after moving in, my phone started buzzing. I was in my new home office tweaking code for a client when texts from my mother lit up the screen. "Fiona, we heard you bought a house in Maple Grove. Is that true?" Another from my father followed. "Why didn't you tell us?" I ignored them. My stomach twisting. I hadn't spoken to them in months, and now they were sniffing around because of a rumor. A neighbor must have mentioned it. Maple Grove was small, and word traveled fast. I didn't respond. Let them wonder. That afternoon, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Peering through the stained glass window, I saw them, Mom, Dad, and Bryce, stepping out of Bryce's sleek SUV. My pulse quickened. They hadn't called, hadn't asked to visit. They just showed up uninvited, like they had a right to my space. I watched them march up the stone path, Mom clutching her purse, Dad trailing behind, and Bryce leading with his usual swagger. The doorbell rang sharp and insistent. I took a deep breath, smoothing my sweater. This was my house. My life. My rules. I opened the door, and there they stood, eyes wide, scanning the Tudor facade like they couldn't believe it. Mom spoke first, her voice tight. "Fiona, we need to see this house. People are saying you own it. Is that true?" Dad nodded, his brow furrowed. We just want to understand, honey. Bryce crossed his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. No way you pulled this off, Fee. Let's see it. I stood in the doorway, my hand gripping the knob. Their faces doubtful, demanding entitled, brought back every jab from that dinner table. You'll be broke forever, Bryce had said. You should have been like Bryce, Mom had preached. Dad's silence had agreed. I'd spent years swallowing their words, but not today. I straightened, my voice steady and cold. Get off my property. Before they could respond, I slammed the door, the sound echoing through the house. Their muffled protests faded as I leaned against the wood, my heart racing but light. For the first time, I felt untouchable. I heard Bryce scoff outside. She's joking, right? Mom's voice rose sharp and indignant. Fiona, open this door. We're your family. Dad murmured something, probably trying to calm her. I didn't budge. Footsteps shuffled, then car doors slammed. The SUV's engine roared and they were gone. I exhaled, a smile breaking across my face. I'd done it. I'd drawn a line they couldn't cross. Later that evening, my friend Irene stopped by carrying a pizza box and a tray of cupcakes. Housewarming gift, she said, grinning as she stepped into the living room. She set the food on the coffee table, her eyes scanning the restored oak floors and stone fireplace. Fiona, this place is incredible, she said, plopping onto the couch. I thanked her, pouring us some soda. We ate and laughed, trading stories about bad clients and Pittsburgh traffic. Irene didn't bring up my family or my struggles, she didn't need to. Her visit was light, a celebration of my new start, not a therapy session. As we sat there, the weight of the day settled. Shutting the door on Mom, Dad, and Bryce wasn't just about a moment, it was about reclaiming my life. They'd come to verify a rumor, to poke holes in my success, but I didn't owe them proof. This house with its arched doorways and glowing windows was mine. I'd built it from years of code, late nights, and sheer will. Their doubt couldn't touch me anymore. I walked Irene to her car, the night air cool against my skin. She hugged me, promising to come back for a proper tour. As her taillights disappeared, I stood in my driveway, looking at the house I'd made my own. The confrontation wasn't the end, it was a beginning. I'd chosen myself, and no one could take that away. The days after that confrontation were quiet. I settled into my Tudor home in Maple Grove, my office humming with new projects. Life felt steady, almost peaceful, until whispers about my family started trickling in. A mutual acquaintance from the old neighborhood reached out, mentioning Bryce's name. Apparently, my brother was in trouble, and it wasn't small. I didn't ask for details. Gossip wasn't my style, but the news found me anyway. Bryce, always the golden boy of finance, had made a bad call. He'd sunk money into a risky real estate deal, betting big on a luxury condo project that tanked when the market dipped. His second home, a flashy beachfront property he'd bragged about endlessly, was foreclosed. His firm took a hit too, clients pulled out, and his reputation as the infallible deal closer cracked. I heard he was scrambling to keep his primary house, the one he'd shown off at that fateful dinner. I didn't feel glee or pity, just a quiet acknowledgement that his pedestal wasn't so steady anymore. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing. Mom sent texts, her tone softer than usual. Fiona, can we talk? We're so proud of your house. Another. We didn't mean to upset you. Dad left voicemails, his voice gruff but hesitant. Honey, let's meet up. We miss you. I stared at their messages, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but every word felt like a trap. They hadn't cared about my work, my dreams, until I'd done something they couldn't ignore. Now they wanted in, not because they'd changed, but because I'd won. I didn't respond. I'd spent years chasing their approval, swallowing their comparisons to Bryce. Their sudden interest wasn't remorse. It was envy, or maybe embarrassment, that their failure of a daughter had outdone their star. I deleted their messages one by one, each tap a small act of defiance. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. My home, my life, was my own, and they had no place in it. One afternoon, Irene swung by my house, her laptop tucked under her arm. She'd been working on a new project with me, a user interface for a budgeting app one of my clients was launching. "Your coding's tight," she said, setting up at my dining table. "But my designs are gonna make this app pop." We spent hours mocking up screens, tweaking colors, and debating font sizes. Irene's creativity pushed me to refine my code, and our collaboration felt effortless, like we were building something bigger than ourselves. It wasn't about my family or my past, it was about the future I was creating. As we worked, Irene mentioned she'd heard about Bryce's troubles through a mutual friend. "Sounds rough," she said, not looking up from her screen. I nodded, keeping my focus on my laptop. I didn't want to dwell on it. Bryce's fall wasn't my victory. It was just a consequence of his choices. I'd spent too long measuring myself against him to care about his failures now. Mom's texts kept coming more desperate each time. "Fiona, we're family. Don't shut us out." Dad called again, leaving a message about wanting to see my house. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted it without listening. Their words didn't carry the weight they once did. I saw them for what they were. People stuck in their own narrative, unable to accept that I'd rewritten mine. They hadn't apologized for the years of dismissal, the laughter, the comparisons. They just wanted access to my success, and I wasn't giving it to them. Sitting in my office one evening, sunlight filtering through the stained glass, I thought about what I'd built. CodePath Solutions was thriving. My home was my sanctuary, and I had people like Irene who valued me for me. My family's absence didn't leave a void, it left space for clarity. They'd never change. Not really. Mom would always see Bryce as the standard. Dad would always nod along. And Bryce? He'd keep chasing the spotlight even as it dimmed. I wasn't closing the door on them out of spite. It was a choice to protect my peace. I'd spent too long trying to fit into their story, but I was the author of my own now. As I saved my code and shut my laptop, I felt a calm certainty. This life, my house, my work, my freedom was enough. I didn't need their approval to know it. A month later, I hosted my first event at my new home. The living room of my Tudor house in Maple Grove glowed with string lights, and the stone fireplace crackled as Irene and a handful of colleagues from my tech projects filled the space. The air buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, a stark contrast to the tension of my family's visit. Irene raised a toast, her eyes sparkling. "To Fiona's empire, CodePath Solutions, and this gorgeous house." Everyone cheered, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This was my circle now, people who saw me, not my failures. As the night went on, I moved through the rooms watching my guests admire the oak floors and stained glass windows. A developer from my latest project complimented the office setup where my monitors sat proudly by the garden view. Another colleague asked about my journey, how I'd gone from freelancing to owning a home like this. I smiled, keeping it light, but their questions stirred something deeper. Standing in the kitchen refilling a tray of appetizers, I let myself reflect. My path hadn't been easy. I'd grown up under the weight of my family's expectations, always compared to Bryce, always found wanting. That summer dinner, their laughter cutting through me, had been the breaking point. I'd walked away, not just from them, but from the need to prove myself to anyone. Building my business, buying this house, shutting my door in their faces, it wasn't about revenge. It was about choosing me. Every line of code, every contract, every nail in this house was a step toward a life I defined. I'd heard through the grapevine that Bryce's career hadn't recovered. His bad investments cost him his reputation, and he was no longer the untouchable financier he'd pretended to be. My mother and father had gone silent, their texts and calls drying up after I ignored them. I didn't need to know more. Their absence wasn't a loss. It was freedom. They'd never understood me, and I'd stopped waiting for them to try. What I'd learned was simple but heavy. Real success isn't about who cheers for you. It's about living true to yourself. Cutting out toxic people, even family, isn't betrayal. It's survival. This house, my work, my peace. They were mine because I'd fought for them, not because anyone handed them to me. I didn't need applause from Mom, Dad, or Bryce to know I'd made it. I saw it in the life I'd built, in the friends who filled my home with joy. As the party wound down, Irene helped me clean up stacking plates in the sink. "You're killing it, Fiona," she said, tossing a dish towel at me. I laughed, grateful for her presence. No lectures, just friendship. My colleagues left with promises to collaborate again, and I closed the door, the quiet settling over the house. I stood in the living room, the fire now embers, and felt a calm certainty. This was enough. Thanks for sticking with my story. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family? Share below.